When I married Josh, I thought I was signing up for a life filled with love, laughter, and maybe a few disagreements over whose turn it was to do the dishes. What I didn't expect was his mother, Diane, inserting herself into every corner of our lives like she had an open invitation. At first, it was the occasional phone call, the unexpected drop ins, and the unsolicited advice on how to run my household. But I could handle that, or so I thought. Josh and I had been married for 2 years, and in that time, I'd built a home I was proud of. I worked full-time as a project manager, juggling deadlines and demanding clients, yet I always made sure our house was in order. Our little three-bedroom home in a quiet suburban neighborhood was my sanctuary, cozy, clean, and filled with little touches that made it ours. Framed vacation photos on the walls, my carefully selected throw pillows, and a coffee table stacked with books I actually read. Diane, however, never saw it that way. She made her disapproval clear every time she walked through our door, purse clutched tightly in one hand, judgmental gaze sweeping across my furniture like a general inspecting the troops. "It's a bit sparse, don't you think?" she'd comment, trailing a finger over a surface I'd dusted just that morning. Back in my day, a wife took pride in making a house feel warm, inviting. She'd eye me critically, like I was failing some invisible test, and then flash Josh that conspiratorial smile, the one that silently said, "I told you so." Josh, bless his heart, would always try to brush it off. "Mom, Emma's doing a great job," he'd say, squeezing my hand under the table while Diane pursed her lips in that infuriating way of hers. But she never let up, and over time, I noticed her influence creeping into our marriage like a slow, relentless tide. It all came to a head on a seemingly normal Thursday evening. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when I heard the front door open. I glanced at the clock. Josh wasn't due home for another hour. Before I could react, Diane strode into the house, wheeling a suitcase behind her. "I'm moving in," she announced, standing in the doorway like a queen surveying her domain. "Josh and I have talked about this, and frankly, Emma, it's for the best. You need guidance, and my son deserves a proper home life." I stood frozen, knife in midair, my mind racing to process her words. Josh had mentioned nothing about this. And guidance? What did that even mean? "Excuse me?" I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. She sighed dramatically, shaking her head like she pitied me. "Emma, dear, you're trying, I'll give you that, but you're not quite there yet. A good wife needs to create a stable, nurturing environment. Josh is working hard, and I can see the strain on him every time he walks through the door." I clenched my jaw, feeling the anger bubble beneath the surface. "Josh and I have a good life, Diane. We don't need—" She cut me off with a wave of her hand. "Sweetheart, I've already made up my mind. I'll take the guest room. It's not up for discussion." I glanced past her, half expecting Josh to appear and tell me this was some kind of misunderstanding. But the house remained silent. Diane smiled, triumphant. As if on autopilot, I watched her roll her suitcase down the hallway and disappear into the guest room, the one I had decorated with neutral tones and soft lighting, never imagining it would house an uninvited guest. I stood in the kitchen for what felt like an eternity, my hands trembling with suppressed rage. I knew Diane wasn't going to back down, and judging by the way she'd made herself at home, neither was I. Josh came home later that evening, looking exhausted from work, his tie already loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He barely made it through the door before I rounded on him, arms crossed and heart pounding in my chest. "Did you know your mother just moved in?" I asked, my voice deceptively calm. He froze mid-step, his eyes widening for a split second before he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Emma, You what, Josh?" I cut him off, my patience hanging by a thread. "You thought it was a good idea to let your mom waltz in here like she owns the place, without even talking to me first?" Josh looked cornered, his eyes darting towards the guest room, where his mother was no doubt listening. "She just needs some time, Em. She's been feeling lonely lately, and she thought it would be nice to spend more time with us. Nice for who? I shot back. Because it sure as hell isn't nice for me. Before he could answer, Diane emerged from the hallway, wearing one of my bathrobes like it belonged to her. Emma, dear, don't get so worked up, she said, her tone laced with condescension. It's not healthy for a woman to be so combative. Josh told me how stressed you've been lately, and I just knew I had to step in. My jaw nearly hit the floor. Stressed? Diane, I have not been stressed. I've been managing just fine without any help from you. Diane smiled, that infuriating, patronizing smile that made my blood boil. Sweetheart, I'm only saying this because I care. Josh deserves a warm, welcoming home, one that isn't constantly messy or thrown together at the last minute. I mean, take tonight, for example. You're still chopping vegetables when dinner should be on the table. I looked over at the cutting board, my hands gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. I work, Diane. I have a job. Maybe if you respected that, you'd understand why dinner isn't ready at 5 o'clock sharp. She waved a dismissive hand. A real wife prioritizes her husband's needs. Honestly, Emma, I don't know how you've managed this long without me stepping in. Josh deserves better. Josh shifted uncomfortably, caught in the middle of the brewing storm. Mom, maybe we should just... No, Josh, I snapped. Let's hear what else she has to say. Apparently, I'm an unfit wife, right, Diane? Her eyes gleamed as if she finally had me where she wanted me. I'm only speaking the truth, dear, and you should be grateful for my guidance. I'll whip this place into shape in no time. I stared at her, stunned. She wasn't just visiting, she was taking over. Diane made herself at home over the next few days, rearranging my furniture, replacing my decor with her gaudy antiques, and worst of all, making passive-aggressive comments about my lacking homemaking skills at every opportunity. I could barely get through a cup of coffee without her hovering nearby, watching me like I was a project she needed to fix. But what pushed me over the edge wasn't the meddling. It wasn't even the insults. It was when she changed the locks on the front door without telling me. I came home from work that Friday, grocery bags in hand, only to find my key didn't work. Panic set in for a brief moment before Diane opened the door, smug and satisfied. Oh, Emma, I forgot to mention, I had the locks changed for security purposes. A wife should really be more careful about who has access to the house. I was done. Completely, absolutely done. As I stood there on the porch, something inside me clicked into place. She wanted control? Fine. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I spent the rest of the evening seething, my mind racing with everything Diane had done in the few days she'd been here. Changing the locks was the final straw, but it wasn't the only thing that had been gnawing at me. Since she moved in, my once peaceful home had turned into her personal fiefdom. I could hardly move an inch without her scrutinizing me. Whether it was how I folded the laundry, the groceries I bought, or the way I neglected Josh, she had a critique ready at all times. The worst part? Josh was completely useless. Whenever I brought up her overbearing behavior, he'd just say, "She means well," or "It's temporary." Temporary? That woman was settling in like she was never planning on leaving. Diane took it upon herself to start redecorating the house to make it, in her words, more suitable for a man like Josh. My carefully chosen neutral palette was overtaken by floral prints, dark, heavy curtains, and the ugliest porcelain figurines I'd ever seen. She even replaced my modern coffee maker with an ancient, clunky percolator she'd brought from her storage unit, claiming it made real coffee. I nearly cried when I found my French press stuffed in a drawer like an unwanted relic. One morning, I walked into the kitchen to find Diane rearranging my pantry. "Emma, dear, I don't know how you manage with this mess," she said, pulling out jars and cans, inspecting them like I was hoarding contraband. "No wonder Josh is so stressed. A cluttered home leads to a cluttered mind." I gritted my teeth and took a deep breath. "I had the pantry organized exactly how I liked it." She tisked, shaking her head as if I were a child. No offense, sweetheart, but your system is lacking. I mean, quinoa? Josh never liked that health nonsense. I'm making a proper grocery list, and I'll take care of the shopping from now on. I slammed the fridge shut harder than necessary. I buy food we both eat, Diane. You don't need to take over. She smiled sweetly, that fake sweetness that made my skin crawl. Of course, dear. I'm just here to help. Help? Right. If this was help, I'd hate to see what she considered meddling. Things only escalated from there. Diane started inserting herself into our marriage conversations, often in the most inappropriate ways. One night, Josh and I were in the living room watching TV when she casually strolled in, plopped down on the couch between us, and sighed dramatically. "You know, Josh," she said, patting his knee. "Emma's lovely and all, but don't you think she works a little too much? A wife should really focus on her home and husband first." Josh, God bless his clueless soul, just chuckled. "Mom, Emma does a lot for us." Diane leaned in closer, ignoring me entirely. "You work so hard, sweetheart. You deserve a hot meal on the table when you get home, not takeout, and fresh laundry, not those wrinkled shirts you've been wearing lately." I felt my face heat up. "I do cook, Diane, and Josh does his own laundry." She turned to me with a sympathetic smile, the kind you'd give a child who just didn't understand how the world worked. "Oh, of course, dear. But men don't always know what they need." She patted Josh's hand like he was some helpless toddler. "I'll take care of things from now on." That was it. I needed a plan. Later that night, I pulled Josh aside in our bedroom. "Josh, this has to stop." He sighed, rubbing his face. "Emma, she's just trying to help." "Help?" "Josh, she changed the locks without telling me. She's treating me like I'm a guest in my own house, and you're letting her." He hesitated, and that hesitation sent my blood boiling. "Look, Em, she's my mom. She just wants to feel needed. Maybe if you—" I held up a hand. "Don't. Just don't. If you won't deal with this, I will." Josh groaned. "Emma—" "I'm serious, Josh. I'm done playing nice." The next morning, I found Diane in the kitchen, my kitchen already brewing her disgusting percolator coffee. I took a deep breath and put on my best fake smile. "Diane, I think it's time we have a little chat." She raised an eyebrow but didn't look up from her coffee. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" I leaned against the counter, keeping my tone light. "I think it's great that you're spending time with us, but we do have boundaries. You can't just move in without asking, change things, and expect me to be okay with it." Her lips twitched. "Oh, Emma, you're still young. You don't quite understand family dynamics yet. Josh and I have always been close. And as his mother, I have his best interests at heart." I smiled tightly. "And I'm his wife. This is our home." She gave me a patronizing pat on the arm. "Of course, dear. You'll understand someday." That's when I knew talking wouldn't get me anywhere. Diane wasn't going to leave on her own. She needed a push. I started small, replacing her heavy curtains with my original ones, swapping out her furniture rearrangements when she wasn't looking, and accidentally misplacing her ugly trinkets. Every time she found something changed, her expression would darken, but she never said a word. Then came the final step. Diane had started leaving the house every afternoon for an hour-long shopping trip. She'd go to the local market, chat with neighbors, and return triumphantly with groceries I never asked for. It was my window of opportunity. I called a locksmith the moment she left. "I need the locks changed," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Today." When the locksmith finished, I stood there staring at the new gleaming locks. My heart pounded in my chest, but a slow smile crept onto my face. Diane was in for a surprise. When Diane returned from her shopping trip, her usual smug expression faltered the moment she tried to turn the key in the lock. I stood by the window, watching with bated breath as she jiggled it, her face contorting with confusion. She tried again, her grip tightening. Then she knocked, hard. "Emma?" Her voice cut through the quiet afternoon like nails on a chalkboard. "Emma, something's wrong with the door." I took a deep, steadying breath and opened it just a crack, enough to see her flustered face. She looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to swing it wide open and let her back in as if nothing had happened. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a small, satisfied smile tugging at my lips. "Hi, Diane," I said sweetly. "Problem?" Her eyes narrowed. "Yes, my key isn't working. Did something happen to the lock?" I feigned a look of mild surprise. "Oh, that! Yeah, I had the locks changed, for security purposes." I let the words hang in the air, letting her remember that those were the same words she had used on me just days ago. Her face turned a deep shade of red, and she sputtered, "You had no right to do that. This is my son's house." I tilted my head, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Actually, Diane, it's our house. Josh and I bought it together, and as far as I know, you don't live here." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But my things are inside," I gestured behind me. "Don't worry, I've packed them all up for you. Your suitcases are waiting right here in the hallway. I even took the liberty of calling you a cab. Should be here any minute." I could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. "This is outrageous. When Josh hears about this, he's going to be livid." I gave her a polite shrug. "Josh knows. And he's not exactly thrilled about how you've been treating me." Right on cue, Josh's car pulled into the driveway. I turned my head slightly, watching as he stepped out hesitantly, his eyes darting between me and his mother. Diane's face lit up, relief washing over her as if she thought her precious son would swoop in and save her. "Josh, tell your wife this is absolutely unacceptable," she cried, clutching the grocery bags like they were her last hope. Josh sighed, running a hand through his hair, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. "Mom," he started, his voice heavy with resignation. "You can't just move in without asking Emma." Diane blinked rapidly, clearly not expecting him to side with me. "But I was only trying to help. She's overwhelmed, Josh. I mean, look at this house." She gestured dramatically behind me. "It's falling apart." Josh stepped closer, his voice firmer this time. "Mom, Emma is my wife. This is her house too. And honestly, you've been overstepping." Diane's lips quivered, her eyes darting between the two of us. "I was just trying to make things better," she whispered, her voice losing its earlier edge. I softened my stance, just a little. "Diane, I understand you want to be involved, but this isn't the way. You can visit, of course, but living here, taking over my home, that's not happening." For a moment, I thought she might apologize, admit defeat gracefully. But no, this was Diane. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and scoffed. "Fine," she snapped. "I don't need this kind of treatment. I was only trying to make sure my son was taken care of. But if this is the thanks I get—" Josh sighed. "Mom, we love you, but Emma's my wife, and she deserves respect." I watched Diane's face crumble for a split second before she plastered on her usual haughty expression. Without another word, she stormed off toward the waiting cab, huffing dramatically, as if she were the victim in all of this. The driver opened the trunk, and I didn't miss the way she shot me one last glare before getting inside. The moment the cab pulled away, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Josh turned to me, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "You really changed the locks?" I nodded. "I had to, Josh. She changed them on me first. And if I didn't do something, she would have just kept taking over." He sighed, then reached out to pull me into a hug. "I'm sorry I didn't step up sooner. I just didn't want to hurt her feelings." I rested my head against his chest, letting the warmth of his embrace sink in. "I get it, but Josh, we have to put our marriage first. Our home should feel like ours, not hers." He kissed the top of my head. "You're right, she'll be fine. And maybe this was the wake-up call she needed." I smiled against his chest. "Let's hope so." The house felt different that night, quieter, lighter, mine again. I stood in the middle of the living room, taking in the familiar surroundings without the suffocating presence of Diane, hovering over my shoulder. My throw pillows were back in their rightful places. The heavy floral curtains she'd insisted on were stuffed into a garbage bag by the door, and my sleek coffee maker sat proudly on the counter, ready to serve my kind of coffee. Josh walked in, rubbing the back of his neck, a sheepish look on his face. "It feels normal again," he said, glancing around. I folded my arms, feeling the smallest twinge of guilt. "Are you mad? That I made her leave like that?" He sighed and walked over to me, placing his hands gently on my shoulders. "Honestly? No. I should have done something sooner. She's my mom, and I love her, but she was way out of line." He offered me a small smile. "I think she just didn't know how to let go." I nodded, leaning into him. "I get that, Josh. But I need to feel like this is our home, and having her rearranging my life like I don't matter, that wasn't going to work." He kissed my forehead. "I know, and I promise. From now on, I'll back you up." A weight I didn't even realize I'd been carrying lifted from my chest. "Thank you," I whispered, squeezing his hand. A couple of days passed, and Diane's absence felt like an empty space I wasn't sure what to do with. Part of me kept expecting her to march through the front door, making some passive-aggressive remark about my cooking or my decor choices. But the silence stretched on, and I realized just how much of my energy she'd been draining. Then, the phone calls started. Diane called Josh first, her voice dripping with hurt and martyrdom. "I just don't understand why Emma had to react so harshly, Josh. I was only trying to help." Josh, to his credit, stood his ground. "Mom, we need our space. Emma's my wife, and we're building a life together. You can't just take over." After that, she tried me. The first few calls, I let go to voicemail, not ready to dive back into that emotional mess. But eventually, I picked up. "Emma," she started, a little too sweetly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry if I overstepped." I sighed, pressing my fingers to my temple. "Diane, you did overstep. A lot." A pause. "Well, I was only trying to show you how to run a proper household. You're young and—" "Diane," I interrupted, keeping my voice even, "I appreciate that you care, but Josh and I are doing just fine on our own. If you want to visit, that's great, but moving in, it's not happening." There was another pause, longer this time, and for a moment I thought she'd hang up, but then she sighed. "Fine, I suppose I may have been a little too forward." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest I'd ever get from Diane. And honestly, it was enough. In the following weeks, she made an effort, real, albeit awkward, effort to respect our space. She'd call before dropping by, ask if I needed any help instead of assuming I did, and even praised my cooking during our next dinner together. It was like seeing a new side of her, one that wasn't entirely unbearable. Josh and I settled into our routine again, and I found myself feeling hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, Diane had learned a lesson, and if not, well, at least I knew how to handle her now. That evening, as Josh and I curled up on the couch, he looked at me with a twinkle in his eye. "So, what's next? Want to redecorate now that we have the place back?" I laughed, resting my head on his shoulder. "I was thinking of changing the locks again, just in case." He groaned. "Please, no more locks." I smiled, feeling victorious in my own quiet way. Diane may have thought she could take over, but I had proven something important, not just to her, but to myself. This was my home, our life, and I wasn't going to let anyone walk all over me again. A few months later, Diane's surprise visits had become a thing of the past. She still called often, of course, but now she actually asked before dropping by. It was an improvement, one I hadn't thought possible. Josh and I finally had our home back, and with it, a new sense of peace. We spent weekends redecorating, together this time choosing things we both loved, not what Diane deemed appropriate. It felt good, reclaiming our space. One afternoon, while enjoying coffee on the porch, Josh smirked at me over the rim of his mug. Think your mom will ever try the same stunt? I snorted. If she did, I'd change the locks before she even unpacked. He laughed, squeezing my hand. I believe you. And I believed it too. Because no matter what happened next, I knew I had the strength to stand my ground, and that felt better than anything.